Hi guy, welcome to the Amigarama podcast. I'm your host Lefarius, and today in our 47th episode we will be taking a look at Shadow of the Beast 2. Yes, we are continuing the series, but before we jump into that, let's have a look at this week's news. Now, first up, something about the show itself. Now, for a long time on Patreon, I have been providing show notes for those on the higher tiers. Now, I've decided to pull my finger out and start recording episodes much more involved and greater pace. This has included a incredible amount of work, that I must say, but what I have done, I've decided to do, is every week I'm going to keep releasing the weekly episodes on a Sunday, and at the same time I am going to release the following week's episode, so the very next one a week early, but only for those on Patreon. This won't affect anyone else because we'll still be getting the weekly shows every week. If you really want to listen to the next one, I mean, like this week it's Shadow of the Beast 2, next week's Shadow of the Beast 3, you could wait an entire week, or you could go on Patreon and download it today. Yes, it's available today for all those at the $4 level. And we will be doing this for the foreseeable future. As I'm sure you're aware by now, especially after doing the CD32 special, you should all know that I'm quite a huge fan of the machine. I still don't have one. It's on my to get list until the prices come down. I don't know when I'm going to manage to buy one. I was even looking at an Amiga 600 recently, and I was starting to get the itch to buy one, and then I saw the price, and you're like, I could buy a CD32 almost with the cost of setting one of them. I don't know, I've already got a 1200, why do I need a 600? Because it's so small, and I've just made some room under the TV, it just slots right in there without... Anyway, let's go back to the CD32. One site in particular I've been keeping an eye on is something called CD32archive.blogspot.com. Now, he mostly posts video on YouTube, and it's usually things like demos and adverts and TV commercials for the games and stuff, but he's also been doing some news and articles and referencing stuff from other sites. You know, he's a huge CD32 fan. I thought it was a pretty good site, so I will post a link to it in the show notes. Next up is something I saw over on Facebook, and it's from the Norwich Amiga group. They hold regular meetings, and I asked them to provide a bit of information and give me something to read out. We held our first meet in July at the One Life Left Gaming Cafe here in Norwich, which basically is a place with loads of consoles and games, old and new, and you can hire out various screens for a while and buy food and drink whilst you're playing. Our first event saw a SWAS tournament at Sensible World of Soccer. I'm sure you all know what that means. The second had 5 Amigas with 4-player Dynablaster proving a hit, along with Speedball, Lotus 2 and many others. We also help to identify hardware issues and have people willing to try and troubleshoot problems. People can bring as much or as little with them as they like, and all are welcome to drop in. It's a relaxed, friendly atmosphere, and entry is free. Ooh, that does sound interesting. The next one is due in October. There's no date confirmed, but it will be up soon on their Facebook page. These are starting to happen on a regular basis. It sounds absolutely fantastic. There's a load of like pictures. I think there's possibly some video on there. It's well worth having a look at. But by all means, if you're round Norwich at that time or you're interested in it, you can even drop me a line. Maybe take some pictures and send me an email so I can have a look, because I'd be really interested to see what this event is actually like. But sounds fantastic. So good luck with it, guys. And so on to this week's game. Now for this week, we are going to cover Shadow of the Beast 2. Now after playing the first game, I usually don't bother following on with the sequels and stuff with series because, well, I've only just started the show and it's still early days for us, even though we've 40 odd episodes. But in this case, I thought, looking at the second game, because obviously when I first play a game in a series, I'll always dip into the others as an afterthought really, just to give myself an idea of possibly where the series is going and what it might be like if I'm going to come back to it in future. But the first thing that stood out to me with this was just how different the sequel was to the actual first game, and this led me down the path of thinking, well, let's have a look at the third game as well. And having a quick go on all three of them separately, and I suddenly realised that, you know, there's enough difference between these three games and there's enough interesting content to do between them that I thought we'd turn this into a bit of a trilogy. So yeah, we're going to cover the second game. Now, it was published by Psygnosis, who released games like Awesome, Leander, Combat Air Patrol, Lemmings, etc. As I said last time, they were a huge company and released piles upon piles of games. The game was developed by Reflections again, they actually did all three games, and they were responsible for Awesome, again came out via Psygnosis, Ballistics, Brian the Lion, which is a very strange platformer, you know, this is when the mascots were king, and Shadow of the Beast 1, 2 and 3. It came out in 1990, so not too much longer after the first game, and it came on 2 floppy disks. It was a single player game as well, so they haven't learnt anything by the first, they don't want to push it into 2 players. And it was priced at £34.95. Now the coders behind this one were Martin Edmondson. Well, I think he was behind this. Digging through various interviews and some links, it seems to be a bit quiet on who the confirmed coders were for this game. But Martin Edmondson did all the full interviews and reviews of the full series and stuff, so I'm pretty much linking him into the second game. And so as far as I could tell, he did Shadow of the Beasts 1, 2 and 3, Ballistics, which was his first ever Amiga release, Awesome and Armageddon 2. Now the graphics this time were done by Cormac Batstone, who also did Shadow of the Beast 2 and 3 and Awesome. The music, completely different people this time. Lee Wright, who did Shadow of the Beast 2 and 3, Pugsy, Innocent Until Caught, Awesome, Amnios. I mean, there was loads and loads of games. Again, some of these developers and coders and stuff do absolute piles and piles upon games, so I'll always pick out the best ones or the ones that catch my attention. Now the main lead for the music this time was Timothy Brian Wright, who did the Awesome music, not for Awesome, but for Agony, another Psygnosis shooter I believe, which is very deep and haunting music. Leander, the Lemmings games, Powermonger, Shadow of the Beast 2 and 3, and Aquaventura. Again, he did absolutely loads of games. Now, as I said before, it was priced at $34.95. I think they pretty much had their hands in their pockets there, like little dollar signs ringing away when they were thinking about doing this, because the first one was so successful and sold so many copies, they wanted to do the same thing again. Of course, with this, they did a nice glorious box set with a fancy print and stuff, and this one just had the t-shirt inside, again with another Roger Dean artwork I believe inside, and they certainly know which way the bread was buttered as the fans lapped it up. Coming on to the sequel, Reflections didn't want to make any drastic changes to like the art style or implement anything that was too different to what they'd come up with before, but they did want to come out and focus on the actual gameplay, because that's where most of the magazine complaints came from, and all the fans that kicked off and wrote letters and stuff were all like blown away by how this amazing looking game with all these fantastic visuals and soundtrack, and then the game itself was just a bit poor. I don't know why, it always reminds me of like the Altered Beast sort of thing that happened over on the Sega Mega Drive, where Sega had this huge big drive to come up with this like glorious looking masterpiece all based around mythical sort of art style, and a bit of humour thrown in there with the arcade and stuff. Nobody really liked that game, it just wasn't good enough. It was an okay arcade title, it didn't really work on the consoles, and a similar sort of thing I think happened with Shadow of the Beast. In Shadow of the Beast 1, the actual game itself, like the engine for it, because it was effectively a demo that had a game built around it later, that really limited what they could actually do, because they really were at the forefront of that technology. They couldn't push it any further, and they were really struggling to make the rest of it fit around it. So they thought, with the sequel, we're going to change this. They're not going to go back to the same old engine. So they actually went back to the original game, tried to come up with some similar sort of ideas, didn't work, so they decided to scrap all that, come up with a different type of engine. This time, rather than having just the left and right scrolling, this one would go in all directions. It did mean, sadly, that it didn't look as impressive, but the push was they could do even more awesome things with the gameplay, or so they would like to think, and they set about coming up with a proper style of game to use around with the graphics, and they tried to match the graphics and the style as much to the original as possible. And it did mean they could do a lot more with the sprites. Of course, having this new engine meant that they could do a lot more with puzzles in the games, because it was really bare bones basic in the first one. It was very, very simple key puzzles and opening doors and things. It didn't really go much further than that. But of course, with this brand new expansive engine, with this big world to explore, they decided to go back and have a look at them and break them out into more like logic type of puzzles. Now, Martin Edmondson did say that he was inspired by old text adventure games for the sequel, and in particular the Indiana Jones films, and a lot of the game is supposed to be messing with that sort of humour and the way, well, maybe not puzzles is the right way, but the way the action played out in those movies. He wanted to try and do something similar with the sequel. He also worked incredibly closely with Tim Bryan Wright this time to produce the score of 14 different tracks. I will put a couple into the actual episode as always. I think the original was just 12 tracks. It was a completely different set of instruments, and he did say that he did want to go back to the original guy, but he was really worried that he pushed him too far, because he was pretty much arguing for his own style and what he wanted. And bear in mind, he wasn't a musician or anything like that, so he approached Tim to try and do something different, not necessarily better, but in the same vein, in a different sort of tone, like much darker. And they used things like an electric guitar instead of like pipes to do the actual tones throughout the game. The first one had a development time of 9 months. This one was 12 in total, so there was a good chunk there. They also purposefully upped the difficulty, which is a very odd thing to say, but he said this in an interview. It's what they wanted. They really wanted this game to be a challenge, and it's why there's only one life in it. Yeah. And of course, he was adamant that they were going to stick to the expansive game world, because he really felt like there was a lot more to explore in this whole Beast world. You know, they were setting up this glorious sort of fantasy world and dark mythological tones and things, and he didn't think they'd explored it enough in the first game, so they pushed it out in the sequel to come up with something, well, what they would hope would be better. It wasn't ported to as many systems this time. Even though it was the sequel, it did not sell anywhere near as many copies as the first game, but it came out on the Atari ST and the STE, FM Towns Marty, Sega Mega Drive, Genesis, typical really, and the Mega CD, Sega CD. Well, that was pretty much it. There were no other like plan versions for the Speccy or any of the 8-bit systems. I don't know, maybe people just really weren't interested in Shadow of the Beast by this point. The story for the second game is incredibly dark. It goes into a lot deeper and richer stuff than the first one did. I mean, that was more of a hint of a story. There wasn't anything really special going in that one. But for this, they really did go overboard, and just looking at the manual, it is several pages thick, where it's almost like a novel. There's that much of it, and it really is deep. But I just thought I'd read some of the introduction because it gives you a brief idea of what the whole game is about. If you thought Shadow of the Beast was mind-blowing, wait till you get a load of Beast 2. Conflict with the Beast Mage's subordinates was tough enough when you had the powers of the Beast to help you. Now you have to face them in an unfamiliar, hostile environment as a puny humanoid. The compelling need to find and save your baby sister from the evils of the Beast Lord spurs you on against seemingly unsurmountable odds. Have you the strength and cunning to survive? Find out within. I don't think that part will be winning any awards, but the one within the actual game itself is actually quite good. To give you an idea of just how good this is, when you first load the game up, you get a full like introduction. It's almost like a movie with these nice still images and visuals, but there is some movement within them, and it might be things like thunder crackling across the top, or smoke coming out of a chimney, or flames like crackling through a window off in a distance sort of thing. It's quite interactive. In a way, it reminds me of Defender of the Crown and the bits of animation that sort of make it interactive art in a way. You've also got some creepy things like a baby crying as it's being kidnapped, and a huge like beast ripping through the ceiling of a small hut and stealing the child away, and which pretty much then spurts on the rest of the adventure. One thing I did seem to have a problem with when I was trying to play this originally, and I was trying to come up with footage and maybe play it properly so I could cover it on the show, is I could not get any version to work correctly. I was trying floppy disks, random ADFs downloaded off the internet, couldn't get it running on the proper Amiga 1200 system either, so I'm not sure if it was an incompatibility issue or if some versions didn't work, and just by chance, as I kept trying like different emulators and things, I finally managed to get one of them to work properly, and that's what we're going to be using for the footage over on the YouTube channel. But it was rather frustrating, and the worst part about it was several times it would force me to watch the whole introduction movie, which is a couple of minutes long. You might think, oh, that's not too bad, but when you're in a rush and it's like 2 to 3 minutes every single time, and if you try and skip it or bang any keys on the keyboard, it would crash out, and it annoyed me no end. Luckily in the end I managed to get one working, and hopefully if you do come to play it, you're not going to have the same issues. When you first begin the game, you are placed in the land of Karamoon, and the first thing you'll notice is the hit in the visuals, especially if you're coming off the first one, because there is a huge difference between the two. This time you are not a beast, you are just a normal human sprite. Looks a very average guy, he's not like all ripping with muscles like something out of Altered Beast. It's a very basic character. You've got items displayed in the top left corner. They're not really, it's not a huge list of them, you maybe get 4 or 5 maximum as you go on through the adventure, and now this time they've changed the hit points, strength points, into not an actual number counter but a visual indicator, which is like a red bottle, and every time you get hit, part of the bottle empties, because as if the energy is taken out, and it's like a red liquid. And the odd thing with that is, I don't know why, but most games when I play like fantasy or RPGs, I always think that like the red potions are pretty much magic, and I kept looking at this at first. It was very confusing because in my mind I kept thinking, oh, it must be his magic meter, he's not got enough magic. It didn't really stand out as a hit, but you might not get that whatsoever, but it really did annoy me. You can of course refill this as you're going around on your adventure, but you do get a fair few number of hits. It was 12 in the first game. I don't think it's as many with this one. You can't really count because again it's different amounts from the bottle. I'm not sure if more enemies tend to take even more. I should have kept an eye on that. I never really noticed. Now again, you only have one life in this and no continues whatsoever. No matter how long you've been playing for, and I think a full run through can take about 50 minutes to an hour, even if you know what you're doing, and this is quite a tough game as well. So no continues is incredibly tough, and there is no way to up the number of lives or make it easier for yourself. You're pretty much stuck with that bottle of red goop all the way to the end of the game. One big difference this time is your character is incredibly nimble. In the first one you were very much stuck wherever you moved around. It was very slow. There was a lot of weight to the main character. This time they've gone more for that platform side of it. It's much more responsive when you move. Now you can move up, down, left and right, but basically up is jump, down is duck, and fire uses the current item and also fires the weapon you're holding. You start off, I wasn't sure what it was at first. I had to watch this several times. It sort of looks like a chain ball, but I thought it was like an axe on a big chain that flicks out in front of you. It goes a fair distance, I have to say, and then it flicked back, which is pretty cool. It's a pretty good weapon. It's not like saying something like Super Castlevania over on the SNES, you know, where you've got the whip and you can fly it off in a direction and whip it around and stuff. There's nothing like that. It just fires out in one direction. And from what I can tell, you can't like fire it up or down or anything. It's just straight head. So it's a bit depressing for an extra weapon. Weirdly, the main character is only wearing a loincloth. Now, I got pretty far in my playthrough as I was trying to prepare for the episode, but I never found any like extra underpants or coats for him or anything as you're exploring the game. I'm pretty sure you don't get the opportunity to upgrade, and I do feel sorry for him because a lot of these parts of these sections looks like they're incredibly cold and he's just running around in a sackcloth pretty much. The controls though do feel a lot better than the first game. I really did get on with them. It's like they found the problem, they realised what was up and they fixed it for the sequel. Now sadly there are no stunning backdrops like what you got in the first game, like all that gorgeous artwork and the huge fantastic looking almost interactive monsters. There's nothing like that in this one. Don't get me wrong, it's very, very nice graphics, but everything's very dark. The skyline in the background, sort of like the horizon, it's nice and high detail, but it's all silhouettes and just shades for like the setting sun and when it's night and stuff, and you really, really do miss all that super scrolling going left and right. And I understand why they dropped that, but it just means that this whole game is missing that high level of quality that the first one had, and it really does make an effect, and it just put me off playing because I was expecting either something similar. I knew coming in that this wouldn't be as amazing as the first because they'd gone out to do something different, but when you sit there and you look at it and you compare it to the first and you just think it's missing so much. The main push of Shadow of the Beast 1 was what an amazing looking game it was, and you've just lost that with this straight away, so it's a bit disappointing. Although the screen scrolls in different directions more than the first one did, because it's not as interactive and there's not as much going on, it really feels cheaper, almost looks like a basic platform game. It's like they've not made the effort. The sad thing to say, because the first game did need this sort of thing to happen, but they really needed to do more, I think, with the graphics on this front. It's very, very dark when you start off. It's brown, it's boring. Now don't get me wrong, they are great looking graphics. They've got an awful lot of detail, things like trees and roots and rocks and monsters and all the bits of like castles and like pits and acid pits and traps and pretty much everything you can think of in a fantasy type world. It's all there, don't get me wrong, and the detail's fine, but it's just not up to that higher standard, and it just causes huge problems, especially in the back of my mind, because I'm expecting that higher level now, and I know the Amiga's capable of it, but they just couldn't make that higher level work with the amount of gameplay that it needed. Now you do get a full free world to explore again, which is absolutely awesome. There's many more puzzles in this one. It's much more reliant on different sections to go through. Now the puzzles in it tend to be a lot more logical in the sense that it's not just like open and close doors. You've got things like levers creepers, cages, spike traps, monsters pushing like spikes and traps and reacting with things. You have to bring objects back and forth and do trading. It's not a massive amount of change, but is enough that it makes it feel just a bit more taxing and it makes it feel a more expanded game. So it is pretty good on that part. The difficulty for this is incredible. It's a very, very tough game, and there isn't a learning curve, and there certainly wasn't, I felt, when I played it. You can go left or right when you start off to explore, but if you go right, you're pretty much going to die. There's like a temporary wall in place until you solve a puzzle later on or find an object, so you have to go left. But when you go left, you have to pass under all these trees, and there's like these things throwing rocks at you from nowhere, and you can sort of jump your way through and avoid them to some degree. If you pass that part, you also hit a big rope bridge across a pit of piranhas which are leaping out of the water. Once you get past them and then come back, they've disappeared, they're not there anymore. But it's really tough not to get hit going through, and there isn't like any health refills in the early section, so you are pretty much thrown in it, and it's almost like a gauntlet when you get running to the end of this up section. You take on a creature and then free somebody who's trapped and get to talk to them. We'll get to that in a second, but as soon as you get past them, you drop down this like huge pit of trees with a huge pit of acid at the bottom, which is instant death, so you have to be very, very quick and careful on your feet. But as you're going down through this pit, moving from left to right, it's not too big. There's all these like little like pterodactyls swooping in from the left and right, and you have to really take your time to move through them. But there's that many of them, it's incredibly tough, and you've really got to be on the ball and careful. It's just incredibly difficult, and I really did struggle through those early parts. I suspect you will do as well. Add to this, the enemies are quite tough. A lot of them are not single hit kills. They will take a bit of effort, and you have to swing your ball and chain out a couple of times. Again, it's taxing and it's interesting that they've upped the difficulty, but I would have wanted something better to start me off with. And the great thing about this is you can talk to people. Now, a lot of the time that means you solve the quest and you give an item or trade something with them. You walk up to them, press a key on the keyboard, and it just starts chatting away. 9 times out of 10 they will tell you a bit of blurb, and that's pretty much gives you a clue where you need to go next. There's no map or anything. It's not pointing you off in a proper direction really, but you're also given the opportunity to talk back to them, and that means you have to actually type keys on the keyboard, and it's nothing amazing. You know, I mean, you can put in full sentences if you want to, but it's usually linked to like keywords and things. But that in itself is a bit clunky, because you just sat there scratching your head thinking, he really did want this to be like text adventures, didn't he? It just doesn't work. You know, you don't want to be, I don't want to be playing an action game and to drop the joystick and lean across and start tapping words on a keyboard. I'd just rather have a list of options to go through. Maybe that's just me, I just like it simplified, but when I'm in the mood for playing an action game, I do not want to be typing lines of text or pausing to mess with the keyboard, or the keyboard use should be very minimal, and it's just not in this. This also is far too reliant on insta-death traps. They are everywhere. If it's not pits or spikes or things that'll take you out if you fall too far into them, it's very annoying at times, and it really becomes part of the game. You've got to be careful. You can explore lots and lots of different sections, but you will be told if you go overboard and start running around like crazy, you will end up dying, and if you die, it's right back to the beginning of the game. There are so many different tracks throughout this game. Pretty much every part of the world that you come to has a different tone or set of music, and these are proper tracks playing in the background. You know, they're always several minutes long, and they do a really good job of presenting that whole world, and it's not as good as the first game. I don't feel, this might be down to a personal preference, but they're perfectly serviceable for this type of game. Now, even though there's all these songs and there's a lot going on, there's no like sound effects, or there is, but they are very few and far between. You don't get one for the attack unless, say, you're up against a wall or maybe a solid object like a door, and when you're bashing away you'll hear like a metallic thud, and that's about it. As you're running around and the enemies are firing at you or dropping things on you, there's no sound whatsoever. It's just the music, and it's very, very basic and limited, and it seems incredibly strange after all the work that they'd done on the first one, because again, that wasn't amazing or anything on the sound effect front, but It had a good range of them. It all sounded different in whatever part of the world you were in, which was great. But with this one, it's just like, oh, we've got this good music. Let's just forget about it and move on. I'm happy to say that the huge amount of monsters has also come over to this. They are nothing amazing. It's not up to the sort of level that the first game had, but every area you visit, whether it be a town or a castle or out in the field somewhere, there's all these different types of enemies, and they really do look different. They're not as big, they're not them huge mini bosses that you got in the first game, but they're all got like different attack patterns. It's not all random coming out of nowhere this time. You pretty much know where they're coming. You can prepare for them and plan it all out, but they work much better than it did in the first game. In the first game, you had this attitude almost of having to stand there and just let them run up to you, punch them, knock them out, wait, punch them, knock them out, wait. In this one, it's not just like reactive. You have to go in there and start running around quickly and dealing with them, and it does expand the game out a lot more than it did in the first one. Though, despite having all them enemies, it does feel a bit like these are just cannon fodder. None of them are very memorable or go out of the way to do anything amazing for you. There are some sort of mini bosses in there. They're never anything incredible. They're not like towering over like 3/4 or filling the screen or anything like this. They're all controllable and manageable in the area that you're within. And it's a bit of a shame, really. It's again, I think it was technical limitations. They couldn't really go much further than this with the game engine that they were using, but it would have been better if they'd been able to do more with the mini bosses, or maybe had some much bigger bosses as you were going through. Again, I'm getting that wrong to some degree because there are sections where there's huge-ish bosses, but they're certainly not to the level of the first one. We seem to be covering the problems before we've actually got to that part of the show where we actually talk about them, so let's jump right in. First off, this is a huge game with a huge world to explore. There's a lot of puzzles in there, there's a lot to do and people to talk to and items to swap and trade and stuff, and it's just very bizarre that there's no like save system or any sort of password or checkpoint. It pretty much just throws you in and you just have to pray that you're going to get to the end of the game. And it's difficult. It really is difficult. So everybody's going to have problems with it. And it just seems so bizarre that they wouldn't even bother to put in simple save points, or even just a choice to maybe sleep in an inn, because you come across a few buildings of people from time to time. They could have put some sort of save or checkpoint in there. Also, one life and no continues. I mean, I couldn't even find any cheats, so it might just be my internet searches were off. I'm really going to have struggles with this when I come to do the gameplay footage that I usually put with the episodes. I have no idea how far I'm going to be able to get, or even if I'm going to be able to get much further than the 20 or 30 minutes I usually maybe manage. It really is difficult. One of the other problems I had with this, especially using the floppy disk versions, and I was quite happy towards the end I managed to get like a working WHD load one, but the load times are atrocious. I mean, I'm talking about 3, 4, even 5 minutes on occasions, and even when it's simple things like going from one building to another, it just takes absolutely ages to load anything. And I know it's a big game and there's a lot going on and stuff. Surely they could have done something with the load time. I mean, luckily most of you won't have to bother with that because you're probably going to be using emulators and things. But if you ever buy a hard copy of this, just be prepared for some epic waiting times. And especially when you first load the game up, it just seems to take ages to get round to anything. One thing I'm sad to say, which they didn't learn from the first game, is that the dreaded game over extended screen returns. I mean, you have to wait for absolutely ages, and even though the artwork you're presented with, it's like Abron there looking up at the sky and a beam of light coming out of him because his spirit's dying off or something, looks fantastic, and there's like this amazing electric guitar riff playing in the background. It plays for ages and you've got to listen to the music and let that get through, which is fine once or twice, but when you're trying to play this repeatedly and try to get places and having to restart is always a pain. Then having to sit for like what feels like 5 hours for this full bit of music to play through, and banging escape or any of the keys or anything, it does nothing. You just have to sit there and keep waiting. The difficulty is off the charts. It is really, really tough, and I understand why they did that, but they really needed a way to ease players in because it's too difficult for its own good. I can understand that would put off a lot of people, especially back then when, you paid all this money for a game and you get stuck right at the early parts, because some of these puzzles can be tough. And you'll really have nothing to do or anywhere to go. And you really, really will be stuck in a rut for ages. And it just takes a lot of time to learn. And I almost felt like it was a Contra game, the level of difficulty. But like some of the later levels of Contra difficulty, not like right from the off when you try to wander around. It does have a point system. And in that regard is you kill a monster, say, and you get 200-300 points as you take it out, which is fine, but it just feels a bit pointless because you're not getting lives from that. You're just getting a score to rack something up on a hit points chart later, but there's no benefit to it. It's completely pointless, and I don't know why they've bothered doing it. I also said before they've got that whole talking system, and I like how they've added it in because it's a way to expand the game. Again, he was trying to pinch that idea of using text-like adventures to get through the story, but it just adds nothing. It would have been so easy to come up with like a list of way of options that you could choose from, because I don't want to waste my time typing on a keyboard. Again, that's probably a bit of a Marmite thing. I really didn't get on with it. I think it's a pretty bad point for the game. Only luckily there's not too many points where you get stuck on that, but it also means you have to pay attention to the text on the screen. You can't ignore any of the story because they give you hints, and well, I suppose you can cheat, and go on Google and get a solution and just cheat your way through. If you're playing the game properly, it's quite disparaging to get stuck on that part. As I said before, it does have an incredible range of music and lots of different tunes and types and tones and things. It's very, very dark, and it's great that they were that expansive with the music, but overall it just feels incredibly bland. It's not as good as the first game, and nothing against the guy who did the music. I mean, he's done a great job with it, but when you've got so much effort put into the music and expanding the game up to that degree, it's not great enough. There's just not enough there, and it doesn't tie in with what's going on in the world as much as the first one did. It's not got that sense of awe and wonder coming out of the music tracks. And again, the music's fine. I just felt it was a bit bland and a bit average, really, sadly. Again, you might have different tastes to me. So I'm just responding how it came across to me. Yeah, it was a bit of a downer for me. It's time to have a look at the magazine scores. Amiga Format gave this 87%, The One 86%, Amiga Action 84%, it's starting to sink now, CVG 59%, wow, I mean it's certainly not on that level, Zap 72%, Amiga Magazine 94%, I don't know who the hell reviewed that, I mean it's not that sort of a level. Now that's incredibly mixed scores, and just reading through a few of those reviews, I think a lot of it comes down to the difficulty and what a downgrade it was compared to the first. I mean, the whole thing with the difficulty, I mean, that one life and no continues, it's not just tough, that's unfair. It really adds something terrible to the game. It's not a very good thing for it to try and do. It makes it overly difficult, and it just goes too far. Compared to the first game, they really have made some incredible changes to this, some proper vast changes. It's certainly a different beast, no pun intended, but it doesn't feel like there's enough there. It seems to be a very competent but average action platformer. There's very little that takes it above average. There's lots and lots of games that do this sort of thing better, and especially by this time, what was it, at 90, 91, plenty of games were more than capable of being up to this level and going beyond, and this was something special. It was a big Shadow of the Beast game, so they should have gone that extra level above. The first one pushed the Amiga to its limit. This is the Amiga 500. There was no like AGA or fancy advanced versions. Even then, this game on the later systems still, when it works, is still very, very impressive. The sequel just abandons this whole side completely. I mean, it's just so uninspiring. They had this huge thing to base it off, and I get that they've taken the world and the fantasy world and the art. That's nice. They've just not pushed it enough. It really needed something better. I don't know what. Maybe an improvement on the graphics. Maybe they could have stuck to the original scrolling and maybe expanded that engine out a bit more to make it even more impressive, because by this point, more memory was available for the Amigas. They could have expanded or given options to expand it further, and they just didn't do it. The first set set the ground for like this amazing Amiga experience. It failed on the gameplay front, but visually and audioly, it just sounded great. It drew you in, it set the scene perfectly. 2 just abandons the lot to become yet another boring platformer. Now, there's plenty of other those out there. Why is this not something better? There's nothing wrong with the game per se, and it's great that they've expanded it like they had and tried to tackle the issues off the first one, but they had that special game. They knew what they were aiming for originally, and they've just not been able to pull it off with the sequel. I mean, it ditches the whole hop, skip and jump attack gameplay of the first one. I mean, that really was quite ropey. That was the problem mainly with the gameplay. And it does expand upon that. There's much better combat now and a lot more to explore and do within the world. It's still not enough. But hopefully this does set up enough to the third game to be even better. Now, I know that's the last in the series before you get onto like modern re-releases or remakes even. Did they do them? I'm still not sure, but I've got great hopes for the third game, and we will be covering that next episode. But sadly, the second one, it's getting there, it's almost there, but it just misses the mark and ends up as a competent yet average action platformer. And with that, it's time to end the show. Now, as always, if you would like to comment or send me an email, you can do so at lefarius@amigarama.com. Pop along to the website, amigarama.com, or even just go onto the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/amigarama. I am getting used to these. And before we leave, I would just like to take a moment to thank all of our Patreons. They are Adam Bradley, Figgy/CTZ, Graham Vebke, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Retro Ravi, Sneff and Treble. As always, a big thank you to those guys. They help keep the lights on. Anyway, until next time, guys.